Hi everyone, AJ here. Just wanted to get out in front of this episode and say thank you all for the understanding when we decided not to release an episode last week to make some room for Black voices and the Black community. I do want to make it clear as we move forward with our regular release schedule that this does not mean that the conversation or the struggle is over. Right at the top of the show notes in this episode, you will find a link to a great compilation of resources where you can donate, sign petitions, and educate yourself about race and police brutality issues in America. Thank you again for all of your understanding. Here is the show.
Hello, and welcome to 10 Very Big Books, a Malazan read-through podcast. My name is Peter Bond, and today on the show, we are in between Memories of Ice and House of Chains. So I brought on a guest, and we're going to kind of have a discussion about Memories of Ice in context to the whole series with spoilers. So if you haven't read those 10 books and you don't want to listen to the show, I think now's the time to tune out and have a nice day. Now, today on the podcast, we had on maybe the only Malazan YouTuber. I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure he's leading the way. Iskar Jarak's on the show, and here he is. Hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. Excited to have you on. Great channel. And it's fun someone's in that space. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you are with the series, how many times you've read it, that type of thing, and just introduce yourself a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I'm in my third read through right now. I'm in Deadhouse Gate, so I'm about a third of the way through, just starting this third round. And I decided to get back into the books. I had read them many years ago for the first time and had to take about a year or two to kind of just mentally process, and then did my second full read through the main 10 and then all the ice stuff about 2 years after I finished the main series. And so I had just finished that up maybe 3-4 years ago as I sit here now. And been reading a lot of different stuff, but actually just decided I wanted to get back to Malazan because I feel like there was still a bunch of stuff a bunch of nuggets left to be mined.
Yeah, I think that's what's kind of great. There's so much to pull from it. And in fact, I'm looking forward to just being able to return to it later in my life too. I have like a very hot Memories of Ice take, but before we get to it, I would just love to hear, overall, what do you think of this book and its place in the series as total?
Yeah, I love it. I'm in that camp, which is a popular opinion out there, but I do think that it's one of the best of the series. I think it even makes sense to kind of potentially read it second, just because you're sticking with those characters and it happens contemporaneous with Deadhouse Gates, more or less. But I really actually enjoyed this one and Deadhouse Gates just because you don't realize how much they're actually laying down for the whole remainder of the series. And, even within like the first third of both books, you're setting up some of the pretty huge arcs that are going to play out for many, many more books. And going through it even the first and second time, there's just no way to appreciate like how consequential all these little bits and pieces are.
Absolutely. And especially, I think in Deadhouse Gates, I was definitely unaware of what was being laid. I mean, I was just like, right. I think a lot of that stuff's pretty going to slip by you. But I think definitely in Memories of Ice, and even on my first read through, I think it's just because the crippled god draws so much attention, plus and maybe you had this meta knowledge that that's the 10th book's name, right? That I was like, okay, maybe that's what these books are about. It's like about this dude. Do you mean? But like, still then, it's really just an emerging thing, I don't think when I was reading it that first time, I had such a clear image, but definitely the second time through, you can see more how like, I don't know, because in Gardens of the Moon, some things are set up, but I feel like really, I don't know, it's more being laid out in 2 and 3.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of just little seeds that seem, inconsequential. And especially if you go Deadhouse Gate, if you go publication order on it, then I think, you're also trying to digest all the new scenery and players that are in the mix and stuff. And so you're just feeling like you kind of got your arms wrapped around the world in Gardens of the Moon. Then there's this whole new cast of folks and you're just trying to remember names and continents and kind of suss out all the political dynamics that, some of of the little gems are easily lost in the shuffle.
Absolutely. And plus, and we actually just talked about this before we started recording. I do think it's one of those things where this time through of reading it, I feel like I'm actually understanding the book so much more,
Yeah.
So you're able to actually pick up on those things where definitely you're like, I don't know, catching names and stuff that first time through. But you ready? Here's my hot take. And I know you said Memories of Ice is very high in the series, right? Like if we're talking about favorites and junk, which I think is probably a pretty popular opinion. I don't know if you can quantify it, but I feel like Memories of Ice is probably the most popular of the 10 books,
Fully agreed. And it's got some of the big moments too. If you're not just ranking the books, but if you're ranking some of the huge moments of the whole series, this one, a lot of them come from Memories of Ice.
Definitely. And I gotta say, reading the book the second time through, my opinion probably lowered of it in a way, you know?
Yeah.
Which I don't want to mislead anyone. I still think it's like a great book, and I mentioned this to Steve when I talked to him recently. It's like, in some ways, Memories of Ice is a very traditional story. There is an evil empire somewhat, and like it is about a bunch of different good armies all uniting and like all this stuff, and there's these different heroes, and the ending is in some ways very traditional, like we're all going to unite, there's this battle, people lose, which I think compared to later parts of the series, like if you take a book like Reaper's Gale, it is a very subversive and unsatisfying book, dissatisfying, right? And like it's on purpose, right? And like he's doing a lot more experimental stuff, and he's like playing with the form and trying to make new things, And I think that ends up being a lot more challenging for readers, me included. So I do think there's a way in that, since Memories of Ice is hung around a familiar story structure in a way, that I think it almost becomes so enticing. And like, I certainly, my first read through was so drawn to it since there's such a clear narrative to it. So I think my time rereading it, I guess, especially since I've grown to love books like Toll Hounds and and kind of more experimental parts of the series, I guess I walked away thinking like, this is a great book, but I feel like Malazan can do such weirder things, and I almost prefer it when it's in that experimental mode. So it's not like I think the book's bad. I guess I just thought, I don't know, it makes me think about the other books in the series. So what do you think of that hot take?
Yeah, no, I love it. I think it's a really interesting take. I think that there's definitely some more kind of tropish elements, if you will, to Memories of Ice. And you have like kind of Gruntle being that reluctant hero and taking on some of the tropes. I think for me, on this, on these read throughs that I'm doing now, I'm really trying to challenge myself. And I feel like that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to getting back into on Memories of Ice, as I was like doing my homework and stuff for this and just kind of boning up on my Memories of Ice stuff is, you kind of come through the first couple books in particular, and you get a little bit of this in Deadhouse Gates, but where, you're pretty clear on the kind of dynamics of where the conflict is and the story, with the Empress kind of being this, double crossing, and everybody's pissed at her, and kind of how dare she disband our favorite squad, and et cetera, and you start to kind of have to, at least this time around, and I don't think I was that empathetic to her before, but I'm starting to look at it more through the shoes of Laseen, and kind of how a lot of the narrative that we've been, there's been an unreliable narrator essentially up till this point with respect to the bridge burners and the dynamics within the empire itself. And I appreciate that part of it. So I totally get what you're saying. But I do think that there's that kind of the tropish bones with this more subtle stuff under the surface, where you're really kind of challenging your own view of what you thought you knew for the first couple books.
Well, I agree with that. And definitely there's a lot more going on, and I don't want to sound like I'm sidelining Memories of Ice. I think it's like, I guess it's just because these subversive things he's doing, because I can think if you take like a character like Kovian, this is not, I don't know, he's still doing some interesting stuff with that character and like taking on burdens and blah, blah, blah. But like it's it's like all dancing around this kind of similar structure that we're all very familiar to, so then when he's doing dancing with the experimental stuff in like Dust of Dreams, I way more get how maybe people bounce off of that book, because there's less to grab onto if you're like looking for that type of, I don't know, big fantasy story that resolves in this big battle against an emperor, Yeah,
clear lines.
So, yeah. So I guess that's all I was thinking about is like just how approachable Memories of Ice is. I definitely think it's the most welcoming of the 10 books in a way,
100%. Yeah. And I think that's why and sometimes I recommend going to Memories of Ice first, just because, again, you don't have that hurdle of kind of learning all these new, folks out there, but also just because it is kind of resembles traditional, modern fantasy and kind of is easy to just get sucked in and have a linear narrative kind of from start to finish where there's, preparations, a conflict, and then a resolution.
Yeah, exactly. There is a really clear beginning, middle, end. And that's why I think it's going to be interesting going to House of Chains, which obviously structurally is just like such a different thing, So, and now to loop around to this Laseen thing, I think it's interesting too, because at the end of book 3, I kind of feel like it's the end of what I would say is the Imperial politics focus, Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but definitely when you begin reading Gardens of the Moon, like the Imperial politics, Laseen betraying them, and, we're these scrappy soldiers. Like, to me, it was very forefronted as like, this is what the story's about. It's about the machinations of the Empire. And it's only when you're on like book, I don't know, like way late in the series, you're like, actually, the Empire's not important. It's like that all of that stuff kind of fades away, Oh,
yeah.
And looking back on it, I feel like it's actually now in Memories of Ice that, like, I don't know, it's kind of the Empire. This is what, I don't know, from here on out, the Empire's kind of unimportant, if it was ever important at all, really,
Definitely. And I came to this, from a Game of Thrones mode. So one of the reasons why I picked up Malazan in the first place way back when was because I was sick of waiting around for it was Dance with Dragons at that time,
Sure.
and so I actually just went online and I was like, what kind of epic fantasy is actually completed? So I was coming into it from Game of Thrones and I was like, oh, I get it. I'm like, we're waiting for Whiskey Jack or Dujek One Arm is eventually going to become the rightful emperor that they should have been. And all of that stuff. And and so like, and I don't think I fully appreciated it until maybe like book 6, the first time around, that I was like, oh my gosh, there's like this whole other thing. There is these gods getting involved on the mortal field and all of that stuff, but they all just seem kind of tangential or little asides, like world building or something like that. And I didn't realize that was actually the chessboard that we were looking at. And these were like little side pots that we were talking about.
100%. That is the main story. And like who controls the Malazan Empire is essentially irrelevant, especially. Right. I mean, and although that's the only reason I was glad I read some Esselmont books the first time through is to kind of have some resolution about that, but that's kind of a side thing.
Sure. No. Yeah. And that's what I love about it is because that's what makes it such fertile ground to go back and do rereads and things like that, is just because it really is this kind of giant 3-dimensional chess game and all these little pieces kind of moving around the board. And so there's just, I don't think you can ever be the Malazan pro.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Your third time through, I think you said you're on your third time now.
Yeah.
What do you think your biggest change from reading Memories of Ice the first time to reading it on a reread has been?
I think just knowing kind of the consequence of it all. I mean, there's a bunch of tragic moments, and I think I realize some of these friendships and relationships that get built during this are actually some of the deepest of the whole series. And like, when you're reading it through your first time, you have no sense of like, again, how consequential these things are. But, I'm thinking about like, Whiskey Jack and Corlat, the friendship that like Animander Rake, who doesn't seem like he, makes friends, like that has like this once in a couple of millennia friendship going with Whiskey Jack. I think that I just appreciate the human emotion of it too, and just the tragedy of it all versus the kind of hunger to, because it is a linear story, to kind of find out what happens versus really like appreciating all of the nuance. And, I hear a lot of people criticize Malazan for not having like depth of character. And I think it's there, but it's not there in exposition on the page. It's more a journey of empathy and putting yourself in those people's shoes. And so that's the biggest thing that I'm, going slower now because I know what happens, and that part, I don't have to worry about. And so like, really kind of mining that human emotion, because there's a lot of, stuff with friendships and bonds and relationships and what does it mean to be good and moral. And, there's a lot of like philosophical stuff bubbling under the surface with like Whiskey Jack taking down the 10 Scoury. And there's just a lot of cool stuff in there.
Yeah. To speak to the characters thing, I think it's very interesting you bring that up, because I think I understand griping with that part of the series. I hear people, and I think it's because the characters, there's so many of them, not everyone, right? Of course, but a lot of the characters are very interesting, but they're characterized in this way where it's not really, I don't know, it's not always forefronted their emotions, and it's like, it's more of an observation thing, and you kind of have to read into it, But I think it's definitely there, since if you think about it, I mean, so much of these books are just people talking to each other, And like a lot of the times they are conveying information, but a lot of these conversations, especially later in the series, so much of it's just like two people talking about an idea with one another. That's like half of the scenes. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I hear you on that. It's interesting you bring up the Whiskey Jack thing. I think it's such a Whiskey Jack focused book in some way, or at least, it really is his. Oh yeah. I don't know if it's his book, but he's definitely a primary. It's the last time he really has his scenes, right?
Right. And I think for the reader, it's like this is where the legend of Whiskey Jack that perpetuates through the rest of the series comes from. You see that empathy, you see these other, who were, prior to these godlike figures, giving him respect and showing deference and all of that, and finding out he wasn't just this kind of squad sergeant guy, but actually, has been a person who commands respect throughout this whole long history. And then he's gone, but that kind of legacy gets built up in Memories of Ice, and that, it carries through the whole till the 10th book, really.
And I gotta say, and I know Whiskey Jack's such a popular character, and like I go against the grain. I'm not like a huge Whiskey Jack fan or anything, but I think what's interesting, there's no coherence to my viewpoint, because I'm a huge Duzek fan, and like, they're like very similar in some ways, So like, I don't know, there's no coherence there, but something that, to pivot a little bit, something that really stood out to me, and maybe it's just because currently I'm rereading Dust of Dreams, is that all of this Barghast stuff, when I first read it in Memories of Ice, I thought nothing of it, and I just thought, because there's the Duzek's host is so big and there's so many different armies in it, I really thought the Barghast and all this lore about them, and then like their future stuff and all this, it was just like more like, oh, well, this is the story of this one army in it,
Yeah.
But it was interesting, especially the conversation Kaffel has in Kapistan, like to see how much it's setting up their entire arc in book 9 and 10,
Oh yeah.
And that's just one of those things, like, obviously I had no sense of in book 3 the first time through. So.
Right. And even the whole thing with the stick snare and all of that, and just finding out their magic going forward. And actually, with Hood's involvement there, I totally didn't pick up on that my first time through. But there's like, all of these different threads are kind of interwoven through that Barghast storyline. And so, there is, just to the original point that we were talking about, like these kind of higher level games that we're starting to get the seeds planted for later down the road that you're like not even paying attention to originally. And so yeah, the Barghast stuff is awesome, and just from a sheer like entertainment factor standpoint as well, they're like super cool. And you see Trotz go out there and do his thing. I mean, it's just fun to read too.
No, of course it's and I think Memories of Ice, to kind of loop back to almost my first take, I think it's easily one of the most fun books. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, it's way more fun. Like some other, like it's a bit of a downer, you know, but like some of Toll the Hounds is a downer book. You know, I know it has a fun, big fun ending, but mostly it's a sad book about sad people, you know?
Right.
Where like Memories of Ice, although like the Tenniscalri are gross or whatever, I mean, it's mostly like cool soldiers fighting cool enemies, you know? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, totally. And you end up getting the W. You get the emotional connection from the early loss, and then the triumphant victory, and then you get the tragic kind of component. So it has it all from the kind of tropism standpoint, which is why I totally vibe with like those original comments that you were making, because it has just all those, you know, traditional building blocks that are going to make you like it.
Yeah, which like isn't a knock, you know. I think it's interesting, and I think it's great, actually. One of my favorite things about long series like this is that it allows each book to kind of do its own thing. I mean, like you can have a Memories of Ice, and then you can also have a Bone Hunters, which is a much, you know, more fluid work in how it's structured, you know?
Yeah.
Another takeaway I had going through Memories of Ice is like how much, you know, everyone speaks about compassion, right? How much really it's kind of the opening argument in a way, you know, or it's like almost when he's most explicit about it, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And this one definitely hits those, like the pain side too. And then the compassion and empathy side that kind of goes along with that. And, you know, the obvious one is Ithkovian, but it's really, you know, throughout, and even in the kind of, you know, smaller moments like Tok Anaster and his rebirth and all of that stuff, when Kilava goes and does her thing with the Panty and Seer towards the end of the book. You know, they're feeling for each other. They're looking at their own mistakes. That empathy and compassion piece is definitely front and center in this one.
Yeah, and recently on our when we were talking about the last chapter on the show, Josh said something that really made me think. He said that like usually villains are redeemed through their deaths, you know, and like in this book, like they have to take like the harder path in a way. Yeah. And I think that's a lot about what's going on, and especially at the end of this year, you know, it's like compassion is the harder path, is like to take on someone else's suffering than like righteously killing or judging them or something. Do you know what I mean? And totally. I think that's what that ending is really getting at, is about how it's just how much more difficult it is to do it, but maybe how it's the right thing, you know, and how like we should try, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's the take that we're supposed to have, right? Is that we're supposed to feel like, man, that's brutal, but you know, they're the better people for having done that. You know, I think even, you know, the stuff with, again, going back to Kilava and the Panty and Seer and his sister and all of that, and just like how, you know, there was a lot of beef there, obviously, on both sides. You know, she's angry about Tok, and they're angry about going into the rift at Morn for, you know, ages and all of that stuff. But then they basically come to a compact for the kind of greater good in ways that, you know, required sacrifice, obviously, on both sides. So, just that's why I'm so appreciating it on the reread too, right? Is because you can kind of appreciate that deep emotional stuff. And coming from the books that I've read in the past, like I was hungry for that deeper emotional side where, you know, and the gray characters and all of that stuff where, you know, just makes you think.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the gray thing. I think that's part of what makes this book so easy to process, you know? Because of how like kind of evil the Panty in the man, you know, it's like, and I'm here for it. You know, it's fun stuff. I love giant vultures, you know, condors. But like, it makes me think about like the conflict in Seven Cities. You know, we're going into House of Chains again, right? And definitely because of how kind of gray and ambiguous it is,
Yep.
I just, it makes me so confused who to root for in a way that I do end up feeling so disoriented that it's like harder to feel that catharsis of victory. And I think that, I think it's very purposeful, right? Because when you get into actually more complicated conflicts and like are actually trying to not have one person be using giant demon condors, like, the catharsis of war, there's not going to be some big like, huzzah, we did it, and I think that's what he's getting to, where it's like these compromises aren't satisfying, and like they aren't easy. But the price of not having war or, this type of violence is so much. It's like a price we should pay is to not have like the huge catharsis of killing, Sauron or whatever,
Yeah. No, definitely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's 100% intentional. I always say if you're looking to read a series as kind of like a destination, if like you're the type where you're reading to kind of find out what happens, right? Then I think that maybe Malazan isn't the best series for you, because it's not about the destination. I do think that you get a lot of closure. It's not one of those books where you're like, and you get to the end of 10 books and you've wasted a year of your life or something. You do get some closure, definitely. But, it's not for me about the destination. It's like about these big concepts and kind of just, really a journey of putting yourself in really despicable people's shoes and trying to understand, where they're coming from. And again, even with the Laseen stuff in this book, I've taken so much heat on the channel in the comments section for just talking about how like I'm kind of like coming around. I'm not like a Laseen fan. She's not my favorite character by any stretch, but I'm like getting a lot more understanding for what she was trying to do, and not just this kind of evil stereotype that you get in the first couple books. She's done definitely a lot of evil stuff, but there's a lot of layers there to try and unpack.
So it's interesting you say that about Laseen, because I have really come around on her as well, and I'm always apologizing for people on the podcast. I'm a big apologist, which is good. I think that's part of the series is trying to get you to do that, right?
Yep.
So we talked with Erickson a bit about the Empire and its kind of morality, and it's kind of in a weird position, and I ultimately feel very bad about the Empire. I think it's a pretty bad force, and but I think what's interesting about the series is I feel like, and this goes to a lot of things, I think Erickson kind of portrays it with a real indifference, which I think is ultimately pretty fair, because it's easy for me to say empires are bad and that imperialism and colonialism are bad and all these things. But, whether we like it or not, they exist.
Right.
And they exist in our world, and they've existed for centuries. So to act like they do not exist, or that these giant forces are not going on, is like, that's foolish. And I think Erickson creates this world where this exists and you can feel however you want about it, but empire exists in our world, empire exists in that world,
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean they're right or anything. I just think it's kind of a force of nature, is how I think he puts it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that it's interesting because, it's in some ways about how people navigate situations that are thrust on them. Gruntle is kind of like a tropish character, but it's like, you have these people who are kind of like even taking the position that we're kind of taking, right? Where it's like, I don't care about that stuff. I'm not involved in that. And, but it happens to them regardless. And so then it's like, what do you do in the face of these, crazy things that are happening? And you get to see just how people navigate that, even though it's, in some ways it's interesting because this is like almost high fantasy. We have like dragons and the Trigil trade guild or whatever who can like open up rents and drive through to the other, dimensions and all of that fun stuff. But it, then in other ways, it's like, it's about the actual like real life human emotion piece and how, what people do with different incentives. And like, you think about Ithkovian and the stuff in Kapustan before the town got sacked. And there's, you had like the whole gamut of people who were responding in different ways, selling out their own people, making deals, standing up for what they thought was right, and everything in between. And so that is kind of, I think analogous to what you're saying on the Empire side, where it's like, this stuff is just out there, and it is, and then it's an examination of different methods of kind of responding to that.
Absolutely. And we should loop back to the Gruntle thing. And I think that's why I brought up the Empire and when you were talking about Laseen, because I think the way you put it is people responding to the situation they're in. And that's why I can have some sympathy for Laseen in a way. I mean, this isn't, obviously, she's not in the right, I know. That's an obvious thing. But like encountering that Empire and you are within it and just like wanting to, raise your rank and, acquire power and do these things and like further the system of the Empire. Like, I understand how she comes to that position and like this becomes her life, So, I know it's a little more complicated than that. I just like, I just think that conversation she has with Kalam at the end of Deadhouse Gates is a very interesting conversation. And I felt really robbed at the end of my first read of it, which I think is purposeful. But the second time through, I just think that is such an interesting, fascinating turn. And I know we're talking about Memories of Ice, just, man, love that conversation.
Yeah, no, it's a great point because, and you see it, even in this book, and it shows up down the road, and she's eventually kind of out there actually fighting in like hand-to-hand combat. And so you think she's just demoted Whiskey Jack, but there's obviously this kind of like, you can't even say a selfish motivation for doing that. It is partly selfish, but it was also, there was an aspect to being able to kind of counter whatever ploys that she was expecting coming down the pike on like the Shadow Throne revenge kind of plot line. And that like does serve a bigger purpose for those troops, at least, even if it is also self-serving for her too.
Agreed. Now to loop back to Gruntle, he is a character who I admit I am still bewildered by. Definitely at the end, it made somewhat sense why his story is in it, right? But, I love his storyline in Toll the Hounds. I'm a huge Toll the Hounds fan, but I literally can't stop talking about that book. Anyway, but, like if you look at my Silverback, Whiskey Jack, Ikovian, I can see how all of these storylines are like running parallel. We're talking about the same thing. They're in dialogue with one another,
Yeah.
And Gruntle's storyline is one that I am still somewhat bewildered by in trying to piece it together thematically and emotionally with what is being brought into the rest of the book. I think for me, I'm trying to think about his relationship to Trake and how that reluctancy to take up a vengeful path can play into the rest of the story. But admittedly, I still am somewhat confused about why his story is a part of this tapestry.
Yeah. That's an interesting point that you bring up. I've never actually thought about that, but I think as you were walking through that, I'm thinking like in some ways it's kind of also just to be able to capstone off the kind of Fenner side of the story too. And I think that he maybe was initially created as a vehicle to be able to kind of start capping that end of that story off, and then just used it as something to kind of pump through a bunch of what would be awesome, project a bunch of awesome stuff onto him on top of that, since we're having to create this character to cap off the Fenner side of things. Because you do kind of see that with with Kapustan and all of that, and also you get the kind of hints early in Deadhouse Gates on that too. But I think that we really see that Fender side wind down, even though it's not going to wind all the way down for a while. But I think that it's the vehicle that lets him begin to start winding that down too. So he's just the beneficiary of getting all this extra awesomeness as a result of having to be created for that purpose, maybe.
No, and that's what I mean. It's a very fun character. Everything he does is fun. He's around Corporal Roach and Boshelin, which are very fun characters, and it's this whole story. But why it's in the book, I think I'm still, on a thematic level, is like, I still feel like I'm processing that, and I think it does have, I don't know. I'm just, Of course,
Yeah,
tweet at me, like that's all I got.
Totally. I'm thinking like plot device that then got imbued with other kinds of entertainment value.
Yeah. Yeah. Who knows? Another thing I was struck by coming through this book again was the Talani Mass at this point, I thought were like a resolved storyline in a way.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to know how spread out they are and how some way their story is kind of resolved here, but we kind of then shift into other stuff. And it's just another thing with the Barghast where it's like when you introduce them in this early, I don't know, it's interesting to see where they go as kind of a race, as a unit,
Yeah, definitely. And you get a lot of that critical backstory and like world building that goes along with them. But I think you get a lot of the kind of motivations, right? It's like, what are these huge like dust cloud warriors that we know from the first book? And you find out that there's like actually like this motivation. That's why I know I keep bringing her up, but I think Kilava's story is so interesting too, because you kind of see even within that world that there's all kinds of, internal conflict there, and not everybody's on the same page with this kind of never-ending war, and that's kind of resonates with where they're at by the time they're basically reaching Coral, right? Is that like a lot of them, and Toole alludes to that even as early in Gardens of the Moon, and talking about futility, and I think there's a lot of buyer's remorse there that you kind of get some insight into where that came from.
It's funny you say that. I actually think I was bothered by that for a long time, and it's only this second time through that I've kind of let go a lot of those qualms I had. In that, like, I almost wish it was a very human-focused story, and that it could just be like, these are the skeleton people. They're like this, period, Yeah. But, like, as with everything in this world, like, no, it's like there's like a ton of different factions, and they all have their own opinions and leaders, because like that's how it be. But obviously he's made it more complicated than that, but like I think it becomes pretty clear late. I don't know, I feel like it's starting here and earlier on that you can see this division you're talking about, which exists in all those other races too. I mean, like, sure. You learn about the different types. I think the first time the short tales are talked about are in this book too.
Yeah.
And I just, everyone ends up having these smaller divisions, which is interesting, but can be a little messy.
It's kind of like the onion. You can appreciate it on all the different layers, depending on which one you want to hyper obsess on during that particular run through the chapters, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, I think we're probably wrapping up, but I guess I would just ask, first let me ask this. Favorite book in the series, are you going with Memories of Ice?
I don't know if I can go with Memories of Ice. I love it. I think it's, I honestly consider the first 3 books like the introduction. Really, it's just one big, giant, long introduction to the series, and so I love it from that standpoint. I love the moments that it has. Again, it has some of the best and most heartbreaking. Well, maybe not most heartbreaking, but it's got some heart wrenchers in there, but also it just tees up so much. We haven't even talked about the bridge burners ascending and all of that, that obviously plays a huge role later in the books. And, there's just so much, again, of consequence and also of backstory that I love, but I still think maybe I'm like a Toll the Hound / Reaper's Gale. I like the ones where they kind of rip your heart out of your chest, then you take like 200-300 pages and keep jumping up down on it for a while. But it is a really good one. I'll say it's top 10.
Nice. It's definitely, I'll get to my thought in a sec, but to pick on 2 things you said there, it's so interesting you bring up the bridge burners ascending thing, which I think is such an interesting plot point because it's kind of working in a meta way, because like their legend is already so imbued in the reader's head that like to then bring it into the world is like, is speaking to our experience, because obviously we recognize them as kind of heroic and legendary and blah, blah, blah. So I think, and that goes for, I don't know, it's just an interesting way to interact with the reader. And then Reaper's Gale, I think, is a great example. I am not a huge Reaper's Gale fan, right? And I think I'm not a big Gardens of the Moon fan, However, reading that book again the second time was a very interesting experience. I was very engaged. I was seeing all of this stuff that I was like frustrated. I just didn't understand the first time, you know?
Yeah.
And I found that reread to be much more exciting and stimulating and thought-provoking than rereading Memories of Ice, you know? Like,
interesting.
Basically, I feel like I reread this book and I was like, yep, still good. Okay, next book, you know? Like,
Yeah.
I had a good time, but I don't feel like I was seeing a new perspective onto it. I mean,
Sure.
I obviously I picked up all this stuff that we talked about all this, but it wasn't like it was just a change of a few inches. You know, I didn't come at this whole new perspective. So I think I'm more interested in rereading House of Chains, the next book, because that's not. I don't. House of Chains is probably bottom 5 for me right now. I don't really think that highly of that book, but I feel like I'm going to see so much more new in it the second time around, and that there's like a bigger opportunity for me to reevaluate this. Then, like, I'm sure I'm just going to reread Midnight Tides and be like, "Yep, still like the book," you know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, and I think those ones that you maybe didn't really like the best the first time around are sometimes the ones that are the best the second time around, because it's about the destination the first time around and not the journey. And I think the journey ones are the ones that do seem like more of a slog that first time, when you're just like, who are these people? What happened? You know what I mean? Like, tell me what happens. Do they win? Do they, and so I think that when you're kind of creeping through them and just kind of luxuriating in the prose and all that stuff, then some of those ones that are maybe more boring on a first read through are the ones where you're like, oh my gosh, he's really laying it down here and setting up some concepts.
I think you're dead on, and I think that's actually what you said, something about your advice earlier about Destiny and Journey, and I think that's probably strong advice, and I definitely think it stands for my reread of Toll the Hounds was so different than my first read, and I think it is because, as you're saying, you can be on your first read through so antsy to get to like what is going to happen, where, how, like, Steve, give me the goods. That, like, when we spend 20 pages with like two people on the shore talking about just abstract philosophy, it can be easy to feel like, yo, what is going on? Like, I hate you shit, like, but then like when, I don't know, almost the burden of wanting to get to the end of the book is lifted off you. I don't know. It just gives you more freedom to sit. And maybe I should have appreciated it more the first time through, but I feel fine about where, I don't know.
No, I'm very much a destination reader prior to this, so I was very, I'm the guy who binge watches and just like stays up till 3 a.m. because there's only a couple chapters left, because I'm just like very obsessed with wanting to know what happens. So that's why I feel like it's taken me 3 times to really actually feel like I'm able to actually absorb. It's like the first time was just to ingest. The second one was to kind of digest. And then this third time through is time to hopefully appreciate and just, again, like luxuriate in it. Cause there's a lot of stuff, even like Deadhouse Gates. I remember hating Fellison that first time through. And now just really like feeling sorry for her and the pity piece, and which I didn't have time for. I was like, oh my gosh, you're terrible. Let's find out what happens.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and that's why, I'm still not a huge Gardens of the Moon fan or anything, but that is the book I think I let change the most. And I think that's why Memories of Ice, Deadhouse Gates, essentially just read and thought, still good books,
Yeah.
So I'm interested going forward to encounter those books in kind of the bottom 5, so to speak. Not that it's a competition or anything. I feel like each book is kind of going about such a different thing anyway, that in some ways it's weird. Like, because I just, what Dust of Dreams is doing is so different than Deadhouse Gates, so.
Sure. Yeah. And I really look at it all as one, big, long story. I'm a Kindle reader, so I actually have like the 10 book.
Oh, do you?
Set. And so it's kind of, everyone always says like, remember that one time in Reaper's Gale, or remember in, whatever. And in the Bone Hunters when this happened. And it's like, I kind of view it all as one book of the Fallen, just because there is no actual, when I was reading it on the Paperwhite, there's no physical delineation. You just like keep scrolling to the next chapter, whether that's a new book or not. And I think that in some ways that kind of, is what you're describing, is that they're all, their own little kind of entries in this one big story.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that simultaneously, like, there is a big connection, and, you know, especially I feel like emotionally is like where there's like a spiritual through line through it all, you know? But really, there is a very episodic, contained nature to each book, you know?
Yeah.
In that, like, you know, at the end of Midnight Tide, like, each book pretty much is its entire story. At the end of it, you could, like, the TV episode's over. I mean, we're done, you know?
Yeah.
And then, like, a lot of stuff is picked up, but, like, lots of the times things are pretty different in the next book, or, you know, it exists both as, like, all part of a continuum and also very separate. So it's interesting. It straddles that line.
Totally. And they don't end up connecting all the dots, right? Like, we end up after book 10 having a feeling of, you know, that we get some closure and stuff, but there is a lot of unaddressed stuff out there. And I think, you know, that's why we're still getting books, obviously, too. But I think there's like almost limitless potential because there's so many things that are left unresolved too. So again, it's not this kind of destination book where they throw out all these threads and then tie them all together in this beautiful little bow for you at the end and put the wrapping paper on the beautiful package and all that stuff.
And I think that's what draws me to it so much, is that, like, ultimately the question and, like, the destination that gets resolved is like an emotional catharsis one. I mean, it's about resolving this question of, like, what are we going to do with this crippled god, blah, blah. I don't know. We're, like, building towards an emotional release. And then, like, those plot things, a lot of those, like, you know, all these, like, tertiary things, they just have to get resolved in other books, or not resolved, because, like, that's ultimately not what the game is. You know, the game is this emotional one at the center of it, you know? And I think that's why it's a good work. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's why, you know, folks like you and me are here today, because there's just so much to so many innards to plumb, if you will, because, you know, there's just a lot of stuff that we can debate about and we can argue about, and everyone can read the same passage and have different interpretations and connect it to different dots at different points in the story. And again, that's why it's a grown-up book. I love it. You know, I came from Realm of the Elderlings and Wheel of Time and then Game of Thrones later, and I started on Earthsea, and this is just very much dealing with things that are applicable to today, deep issues, philosophical issues, moral issues that even though it's high fantasy, it feels like applicable to just regular life too.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being on the show today. If people wanted to hear you talk about the books more, they can find you on YouTube. Anything else you can do a little plug? You want to do a little plugs? Go.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thank you so much. No, we're on YouTube. I created the channel just because that's kind of my medium, where I'm always like watching YouTube videos, and I'm like, why isn't there any Malazan YouTube videos? And so I decided to take a stab. I'm at Iskar Jarak on YouTube. We have a little Discord set up, which you can find in the description of our videos, and Facebook. And I'm trying Reddit, but I'm pretty terrible at Reddit too. So mostly on YouTube, but I really appreciate having someone to nerd out with on the series. That's why I started my channel. That's why I accepted the invite to be here today, and just had so much fun.
Had a lot of fun too. I'm sure we'll talk again, and we'll include a link to Iskar's channel in the description of the show. And I think I'm unsure about what episodes of the podcast come out next. I think there's some special episodes, and then we'll get to House of Chains. As always, we're 10 Very Big Books on Twitter and Gmail. Let us know what you think of the show, or what you think of Memories of Ice in the span of the whole series. And that's about it. Thanks again, Iskar, and goodbye.
See ya.
Hello everyone, producer AJ here, having some deja vu. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode, and thank you so much to Iskar for agreeing to come on the show. If you haven't checked out any of Iskar's videos, I would highly recommend you check them out in the link in the description. Secondly, there is another episode in the feed today. Pete spoke with Josh and I about the first collected tales of Bocalane and Corbel Broach. It was a great time to read and to talk about these stories, so if you want to listen to that, head on over to our feed and you can start listening right now. Like I said in the beginning of the episode, thank you all for being so great and understanding about making room for the Black community last week. It really means so much. Also, don't forget to visit the link in the show notes for some great resources to help out and to learn. If you'd like to join our community Discord, you can head on over to bit.ly/VBB Discord. That's capital V, capital B, capital B, capital D, Discord. That link will also be in the show notes. And as always, thank you so very much to Dan Gesrick for making our spectacular logo. You can follow him on Twitter at Dan Gesrick for the hottest bear takes. And of course, the wonderful music in today's episode is Floating Man by the one and only Amaranthin from their album The New Romantic, which you can find along with Simulant Marine and their other music on bandcamp.com. Links to their pages will be in the show notes, and 10 Very Big Books will be back next week on June 19th with a very special D&D episode. We are very excited about this one, and we hope you are too. I'll talk to you then, and thank you so much for listening.